Welcome back to the Nomiki Show. So I'm really interested in this topic because, first off, as a New Yorker, I'm really interested. I think the history of New York is fascinating and jarring. The more you look into it, was one of the first things I did when I moved to New York, because I spent like a year reading books on like the history of New York City. Our next guest is Jonathan Daniel Wells. He's a professor and author, a history professor at the University of Michigan, and the author of The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery, and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess first off, what inclined you to write this book at this time?
Well, I think we all know that New York City today is an amazing place, right? It has this pluralistic culture. It tends to be very progressive politically. But what I think a lot of people didn't realize was that the city harbors this much bleaker past. And I think that's true of America more generally, but I wanted to focus in on New York City as kind of a microcosm of that story. And to get people to realize that, yes, freedom and liberty are part of the American story, but so too is the denial of that liberty and how important that is to our founding as well.
So, of course, on the eve of Civil War, the North, we know our basic history. The North was against and against slavery, and the South was for it. But the harbor of New York, you said harbor, and I thought you were going to go into the New York harbor, was the gateway for Caribbean slaves to enter right near Wall Street. I mean, is that not how New York really started to flourish, was off of that slave trade?
Absolutely. And that's one of the most important points, I think, of the book, which is that New York City, as I say in the book, is the most pro-slavery and pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I don't say that lightly. And the reason is because both the harbor, as you just mentioned, as well as the city streets in and around Wall Street and Lower Manhattan, they were all subject to police violence against Black people. They were subject to this almost lawless expression of white dominance and white supremacy. And the reason why the police and judges and lawyers and slave catchers, who are quite rightly called the Kidnapping Club, are able to operate with impunity is because New York is just this very southern city in many ways. And it's really antithetical, I think, to the way we think about the city today. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the harbor was used in the transatlantic slave trade, which was supposed to have been ended long before in the early 1800s, and nonetheless really continued all the way to the Civil War. And it was particularly bad in the 1850s, just before the Civil War, when New York's complicated and busy, chaotic harbor, where hundreds of ships would come in and out every day, was a place where it was kind of easy to engage in the slave trade because, pretty much the city wharves were too busy to notice.
Really? So that's fascinating. So you had police and these kidnapping, these folks kidnapping Black people. Why New York? Like, I understand that the slave trade continued, but why? What was so special about New York? Why was New York able to get away with it and not other parts of the Northeast?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there were incidences of kidnapping in places like Philadelphia, but not to the extent that we see in New York in the early 1800s. And really the reason is because much of Wall Street's wealth, the banking industry, the financiers, the credit lending agencies, the merchants, and life insurance companies and insurance companies make a tremendous amount of money off of the cotton trade with the South. So all those hundreds of thousands of bales that are being grown by African Americans under enslavement is being baled up, and ultimately it's going to head to places like the UK, to textile mills in Liverpool and Manchester, or to New England. But before they get there, all of this has to be negotiated and facilitated by rich New Yorkers. And so they know exactly where their wealth comes from in large part, and it's based upon, in no small part, the cotton trade with the slave South. And so that makes New Yorkers very sympathetic to the South. It makes them very sympathetic to slavery. And by the way, I think it's worth mentioning, this is not an intention to diminish the horrors of Southern slavery by saying, "Oh, look at New York," right? It's almost as bad. Nothing a historian could do would take away from the horrendous nature of slavery as it existed in the American South for 2.5 centuries. But it is to say that, in places where we kind of least expect it, America's evolving. Its emergence as a world power, both financial and political, is tied in complicated ways that we're really only beginning to understand to this system of Southern slavery, even if you weren't in South Carolina or Texas.
So why did they end up coming out against slavery in the end, if so much of their financial interests were tied to the South and New York?
Well, they didn't in New York City. New York City, interestingly enough, remains a pro-South city all the way through the Civil War. New York City votes against Lincoln. It votes against the suffrage of Black people in 1860 at the same time that they vote against Lincoln. And all throughout the war, I mean, you're right, there is some truth to the fact that New Yorkers do come around to supporting the war much more so than they would have before. But New York City remains all throughout the Civil War and afterwards a complicated place where, yes, you're absolutely right, there were people who had come to believe in the Union cause, including the Emancipation Proclamation, but there were a lot of other New Yorkers who resisted that tooth and nail. And one of the most famous examples of that is the draft riots that happened in July of 1863. So,
who was the governor at the time?
A man named Horatio Seymour is the governor of New York in 1860 and through most of the Civil War era.
And so at the same time, you have upstate New York, where there's just tremendous organizing happening. The Underground Railroad, of course, moved through upstate New York. How did he balance this complicated state, which, I think today you'd think of it in reverse, but maybe not. Who knows? Meaning upstate having a very different culture than the city. But, I mean, how did he manage this dichotomy, this complicated scenario of his state?
He was a pretty conservative Democrat, but he was able to keep hold of the city while also getting a sufficient number of people in the rural upstate areas to support him. And actually, the city and the state really toggle back and forth between the two parties at the time in the 1850s, the Whigs and the Democrats, and then the Republicans and the Democrats. And it's interesting you mentioned the difference potentially between the city and upstate New York, because today, of course, we all know that the real divisions in American politics is between rural and urban, right? So if you have an urban area of the South or the North or the West, they tend to vote for Democrats. But rural Michiganders, I live in Detroit, so rural Michiganders are as likely to wield Confederate flags as rural Alabamians. So that division that we kind of have ingrained in our own politics today was strangely reversed in the years before the Civil War, because a lot of upstate New Yorkers, as you mentioned, they were anti-slavery. They avidly pursued the Underground Railroad and proclaimed their belief in Black freedom, if not Black equality. Whereas New York City was the one that was the conservative, reactionary city politically in comparison to the rest of the state. So it really is different from the way we think about politics today.
So let's talk a little bit about Tammany Hall, because you do touch on Tammany Hall. And I mean, from what I understand about Tammany Hall, it was as complicated. And, of course, there's corruption involving Tammany Hall. But there was this other side of it, which was folks needed jobs, and immigrants, whether Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Greek immigrants, they needed jobs too. And Tammany Hall represented that part of the party, politicking in New York, especially downtown, in sort of fighting back against like the oligarch types in New York. So what was their role in all this?
That's a really important question, because Tammany Hall was really closely associated with the Democratic Party. And, again, different from the way we think about politics, and particularly partisan politics today, the Democrats in this period of American history, throughout most of the 19th century, they're the conservative party, meaning that the Democrats are opposed to racial progress, racial equality, generally opposed to Black civil rights. Now, of course, that's going to change in the 20th century, but that's the way it is in the 19th century. And the Republicans are the ones who are, to some extent at least, pushing for Black civil rights. And Tammany Hall is the powerhouse of the Democratic Party in New York City. And it's important to realize that you're absolutely right that, sort of later in the 19th century, you're going to get Greeks and Polish people, Italians. But mostly Tammany Hall represents what they consider white New Yorkers, mostly working class Irish, but also, they're open to German Americans becoming a part of their political entity. But they don't see Italians or Greeks or Southeastern or Eastern Europeans as part of that process. So, yeah, you're right. It's a complicated story, but Tammany Hall is absolutely at the center of New York City power. And on the one hand, they represent the working class and all of the needs that the working class has, the Irish working class. It's a terrible place to be a member of the underclass because the tenement housing is unsafe and it's unhealthy, unsanitary. The wages are low. There is, very little protection for you on the job. But at the same time, because they're so beholden to protecting their own interests, they see Black people and any other people from, say, Southeastern or Eastern Europe as potentially competitors. So at the same time that they have these working class politics, they're also deeply racist.
Deeply racist, but, if New York, at least early Tammany Hall, when it was more white, or what we espouse to be white today. I don't know if Irish considered themselves white back then, but if how would they tie into slavery, though? I mean, it's not like they could organize slaves. So, weren't they automatically out of that process? I'm just very curious how, like, the working class politics rubbed up against this very Wall Street driven politics that was exploiting slaves.
Well, it's no different today when many of the white working class around the country are seeing in Trump, who's supposedly at least a multi-billionaire, as someone who represents their interests. I mean, it's been part of this working class dilemma in American history for a long time. And that's why, another reason why I wanted to write this book. I think you had asked me that at the beginning of our conversation. And trying to understand the motivations of the white working class was a key part of why I wanted to delve into this. And it really comes down to fear of economic competition, fear of competition for jobs, and the notion that if you're going to elevate Black people to citizenship, to equality, political equality, social equality, that somehow has to take away from them. Like the pie is so, well defined that one piece out means that they will lose what little protection they have for their jobs, what little protection they have for their housing. So it's an interesting comparison to sort of white working class politics today. But I also, if you don't mind, I just want to add, it's just a story also about Black resistance, right? So, again, comparisons to today, but there's some really interesting people, including David Ruggles, who, for lack of a better word, is kind of the hero of this story, who really fight against racial injustice, against the kidnapping club, against the political and city authority machinations to try to take away their civil rights. So as bleak and demoralizing as the story can be as we, approach the election, we also can take heart in that there are people who fight back, and they matter too.
Today, there's this, the reason I ask about the politics is just there's this this resistance of city leaders across the country. But, Mayor de Blasio ran as a progressive, tale of two cities, talked about his Black children, talked about the racial disparity in New York. This is what he ran on, and really what made him different from the other candidates in the race. And as a result, he's been able to mobilize the New York City Black vote, which, you know, in New York, demographics really matter. Like, there's still a lot of that kind of contained within New York City politics. And yet, he has been absolutely beholden to the New York police unions, and to a point where many people even say, like, what do they have on him? Because it's such an embarrassment to him. His approval ratings have gone down. This is, as you said, a pretty much progressive city, more or less, with exception to maybe Wall Street. But there's a legacy here with the police unions, and there's a legacy of the police department in New York. And of course, the makeup is probably very different today than it was back then. But can you kind of help us track the Kidnapping Club and how the police dealt with slaves in New York in the Civil War era to today?
Sure, absolutely. I'll try to be brief because it's a long story, but in essence, there's this group of judges, as I said, and some lawyers and police officers. There's a couple of really nefarious ones named Tobias Boudinot and Daniel Nash. They're a couple of really real pieces of work. And, they're arresting Black women, children, and men off the streets of New York. And the whole system, the political system and the legal system, is geared toward basically assuming that any Black person who's arrested as a runaway is in fact a runaway, whether they're born free or not. And this is another part of this American history that I think sometimes we lose track of if we don't understand the denial of freedom and how central it is to our national story, because it's right there in the original Constitution. It's the Fugitive Slave Clause. And it says that if somebody makes their way to freedom in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, wherever, that doesn't mean they're free. Instead, what the Constitution says, our nation's founding document says, that those people have to be returned to their owner, essentially, the person from whom they escaped. But it's really hard to tell if somebody's a runaway or if somebody's born free. And that doesn't make the fugitive slave renditions any more morally acceptable. But the point is that, the Kidnapping Club, and this is, by the way, the term that David Ruggles, the famous Black activist, kind of like the Frederick Douglass of New York City, calls them. He's the one who calls them the New York Kidnapping Club because he wants to make public all their horrific machinations. So the Kidnapping Club doesn't care if you're born free. They don't care if you're in fact a runaway slave. They use the Constitution and then subsequent laws to arrest anybody that they feel like, really. And that means that Black freedom for everyone in New York is extremely precarious. And it's one of those things where if you're a Black family living, say, in Seneca Village, which was the great Black neighborhood that was decimated and cleared away to make Central Park, and you got this knock on your door in the middle of the night, you knew that there was danger behind that door. And for decades, it really made the experience of freedom for Black people in New York extremely fragile.
Did this all change after they were granted their universal freedom?
To some extent, it changes even before that. Okay. So one of the things that happens sort of in the middle to the end of my book is that New York State, which is now in control of sort of people sympathetic to Black civil rights, guys like William Henry Seward, for example, who was a politician. And they pass a law that says you have to have a jury trial if you're going to accuse somebody of being a runaway slave. So before that, there were a number of instances in which this police officer, Tobias Boudinot, along with his buddy, Daniel Nash, they arrest somebody for being a runaway. They take him before the city recorder, Richard Riker, who is kind of like Justice of the Peace, kind of. And they...
for Rikers Island.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to unearth all that, just as an aside.
Yeah.
I think the point is, I don't think it actually comes from Richard Riker's name per se, but certainly the Dutch past of New York, where the name Riker would have come from. The point is that they're all complicit anyway. So whether or not it's actually his name on Rikers Island doesn't take away the fact that he participated in the cheapening of black freedom in New York before the Civil War. And they could do that in a couple of hours. Riker would declare, okay, this guy is not Joseph Collier like he says. He's really Abraham Gosley, and I declare him a slave. And before anybody knew, before the guy's family even knew what had happened, he's already on the way to bondage. So the jury trial helped that a lot because, now you had to have, you had to sit down and present evidence and say, I was here, in 1830, long before you claim I had run away. I was here in New York, so I can't possibly be the person you claim. So, it's, the legal part of this is a big, important part of the story.
I mean, what is, as a New Yorker, it just, stop and frisk under Mayor Bloomberg. His resistance to end stop and frisk, where black kids or anybody could be stopped and completely, frisked, found something on you and locked up. Ending cash bail. I mean, there's so many systemic issues in New York City and obviously across the country, but in New York City where, full disclosure, I ran for office in New York, the city council is supposedly progressive. The mayor is supposedly progressive. The state senators are supposedly progressive. Yet we deal with these issues in such a Band-Aid sort of way, way past public opinion. Like, public opinion is against all of these tactics. And yet we still find ourselves facing the police unions and special interests that are resistant to any sort of, reform or shutting down of jails. It's really concerning hearing the similarities and just how similar these tactics are to today.
Yeah, you can get pretty demoralized, particularly when you realize that, children were the victims of this kidnapping. There's one story in the book about Henry Scott, who was 7 years old, sitting at his school desk, practicing his letters in the African Free School. And, in walks a police officer and a white man claiming to be his master. And you can imagine, that upsets the whole classroom. And children are running in every direction. And, the stories of children are especially troubling, but you're absolutely right. The whole story of history not really repeating itself, but not necessarily changing as much as we would like either, is pretty painful. But again, I think that's why it's necessary to resist, right? It's necessary to fight back. And that's why I found David Ruggles so interesting, is because he's kind of this imperfect hero. He's a guy who rubs people the wrong way, right? He's a radical agitator. So he's kind of a pain in the neck. And that's not just to, people in the police force or in city politics or city recorder Richard Riker, but he actually, ends up angering his own fellow black civil rights activists. But, that's because he is tireless. He is everywhere at once, and he resists the illegitimacy and the injustice and the immorality of this system. And I think that's where, as demoralizing as the comparisons can be, that, we take some solace in the bravery of people who sacrificed a lot to just to fight back.
Jonathan Daniel Wells, fascinating history, fascinating book. Can we put that up on screen again real quick? Definitely go check out his book at your independent bookstores, ordering them online if you can. That's the best place to go. The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street Slavery and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. Thank you so much for coming on, and really, really fascinating conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on the nomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.